So the last video introduced this idea of race as a social construction of reality. We'll finish talking about that in this video and then also introduce the terms of racial bias and racism and understand how race contributes to systems of inequality that we study in the field of sociology. So when we left off, we talked about how race has changed in the way it's been defined in the United States over the past several hundred years. And then this is just an exercise if you'd like to further understand how a person's race could have been in one category at one point of time and then categorized in a different race at another point in time. You can look at some contemporary examples of individuals. These are various celebrities and athletes that you may or may not be familiar with, and you can see that their current racial categorization is listed on the slides here. And if you go back to the previous slide, you could see how at some point in time, someone who maybe would have identified, for example, as Chinese would have been identified as other or black even at a different point in time in history, depending on how race and the racial categories we as a society use have been defined. So if you'd like to go back in the slides after viewing the video, you can do that just to better understand how race is something, again, that we as a society socially construct. We decide who counts in one racial category, and that's important as we'll talk about moving forward here because race has a very, very significant role in the way that we're treated as members of a society and affords us certain privileges or disadvantages. So as that exercise shows, the way people are categorized into races has changed significantly throughout history. The socially constructed criteria used to define people as white versus black today are very different than they were in the past. For example, at some points throughout history, we in the United States use what were referred to as one-drop rules, meaning that if any individual could have a single drop, as they called it, of African-American lineage identified to them, they would be categorized as a person of color. Even if you have very white or fair skin, if they could prove that you had a great-great-great-grandparent who, for example, was African-American, you too would be labeled as African-American, which of course used to mean that in the early years of the U.S., you could be enslaved even if you passed as a white person if you fell under these one-drop rules. And just to put into context, even people, like I said, who have fair skin or people who today we would racially categorize as white, at different points in history were actually treated as racial minorities. For example, in the early 1900s, quote-unquote white-skinned Irish and Italian people were not considered white. They were considered people of color, and they were oppressed by society because of that. Again, all of this evidence historically viewing how racial categories has shifted throughout the United States and throughout history, and understanding how we've categorized and labeled people of different races and different ethnicities in certain categories as being either privileged or oppressed is all evidence to show us that race is, again, something that we have socially constructed in the United States. So what are the implications of this? Why do we as sociologists and social scientists in general like to study race? Why is it important to us? Well, because we live in societies that are built on systems of inequality resulting in prejudice and discrimination. So let's unpack these terms here. First of all, stereotypes are oversimplified generalizations about groups of people. I'm sure all of you have heard many stereotypes. Hopefully you're able to recognize when you hear a stereotype and don't fall into the traps of overgeneralizing entire groups of people based off of assumptions that are often ignorant and not backed in science. Stereotypes can sometimes be positive. For example, there's a stereotype that women are smarter than men in some instances, but they also can be negative and oftentimes have negative connotations. For example, the stereotype that poor people are lazy. And these negative stereotypes can be based on virtually any characteristic. It can be based off of race, gender, sexuality, age, etc. Again, there's thousands of stereotypes that get circulated around the media and in everyday conversations. And as sociologists, again, as our objective as scientists is to find objective information that is based in reality that can be scientifically proven to be true or false. We are very, very reluctant to further stereotypes, especially stereotypes that are not grounded in accurate information. Prejudice specifically refers to biased thoughts and prejudgments that are based on flawed assumptions about groups of people. So prejudice, it's very important to note, are again learned behaviors. Nobody is born being a bigot. Nobody is born being a racist. However, If you live in a society that perpetuates certain stereotypes, you may come to internalize those stereotypes as your belief system. They may become very important beliefs that you hold depending on the particular cultures or subcultures that you're a part of. And as a result, through time, you may be socialized to learn prejudice, and those prejudice, like I said, may become part of your belief system, which means they can be very difficult for you to overcome. If you're socialized to believe a certain way, if you're socialized to believe in a certain stereotype or prejudgment about a group of people, it can be very difficult for you to overcome that prejudgment or that stereotypical behavior, which can result in prejudice against a certain group of individuals. Discrimination refers specifically to prejudiced actions that are taken out against a group of people. So having a prejudice is different than discriminating against someone. Prejudice is the thought, right? It's the idea or the belief that the assumptions you're making about people. Discrimination is the behavior. It's an action against someone, right? So if I'm the boss of my own company and I deliberately am not going to hire anyone who is over the age of 50 because I don't want any old people working for me, that would be a discriminatory act, the act of not hiring them. The belief that older people are less competent workers would be a prejudiced behavior, right? The prejudiced assumption, the belief that I have that older people are not as effective workers, okay? So connecting this to the topic of race and ethnicity, racism refers to prejudice and discrimination that occurs based on race. It's really important to recognize that racism still exists in our society today. Some people think that since slavery was abolished or that since the Civil Rights Act happened, racism is no longer a problem that affects the United States, and that is so far from the reality. It is so important to recognize this. And like I said in the previous video, it's very difficult for us, especially as white people in society, to acknowledge that racism exists because it makes us uncomfortable. But it is so important that we lean into these uncomfortable conversations about racism, because if we don't at least acknowledge that they exist, we can never truly get rid of them in the first place. So institutional racism refers to the ways in which racism is embedded in the fabric of society. So think back towards the beginning of the class when we talked about social structures, right? These kind of durable frameworks that guide human behaviors, right? Things like the workforce, education, the media, etc. All of those structures have racism built within them because the United States, our society, was built on the premise of racism. We were built on this idea that white people are privileged, that they are more deserving of power and certain benefits than people of color. So it's impossible for us as a society to not recognize the lasting impacts that our racist society has instilled and continues to affect our current society that we're in right now. So remember, social structures are durable. They're socially constructed frameworks that influence human behaviors, and they're built to withstand the challenges of individuals. Given that virtually all U.S. social structures, including the law, medicine, workforce, education, the media, etc., were all created by a racist society, it's easy for people who are not negatively impacted by racism, specifically white people, to ignore this reality, despite the mountain of evidence that proves the persistence of racial inequality in today's society. So maybe you're someone who's very reluctant to accept this. Maybe you're thinking, I don't believe that racism is still an issue. I don't believe that we still live in a racist society today. I definitely am not racist. I'm going to provide you a number of different studies in the following slide here that provide peer-reviewed empirical scientific evidence of the existence of racism today. Racial disparities in school discipline. In comparison to white students, black students are at risk of being expelled 3 times at a higher rate in comparison to white students, and black students are 4 times more likely than white students to be suspended. And this remains constant even when the behaviors that are being done are equal. So for example, if a white student talks back to a teacher and a black student talks back to the teacher saying the exact same thing, a black student is still 3 or 4 times more likely to be expelled or suspended in comparison to a white student. Social scientists also do a lot of studies that are called resume audits, where essentially we'll send out resumes to thousands of employers and ask them whether or not they would either hire the individual or give them an interview for the position. And even when those resumes that get sent out are completely identical, when there's nothing different in the resume other than the name, white-sounding names, for example, Emily and Greg in this study, are more likely to get called back for a job interview or be offered a position than names that sound like they belong to a racial minority. So Emily and Greg in this particular study were 30% more likely to get an interview for the position in comparison to Lakeisha and Jamal. And again, these resumes that get sent out, credentials, exactly the same. Same education, same work experience, everything the same. The only thing different is the name. And the name either sounds like it's from a white person or a person of color. The white person is far more likely to get the job offer. Wealth is obviously not equally distributed throughout the United States. The median wealth of white households is 16 times that of African American households and 14 times that of Latino households in the U.S. Black people use less drugs than white people. However, a black person is 6 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs in comparison to a white person in the United States. The rape of an unconscious person in this particular example, a white person who raped an unconscious person got 6 months in jail, the exact same act being committed by a person of color, and that person got 15 to 25 years in jail. Black men are 2.5 times more likely than white men to be killed by the police. Black people are more likely to be shot in their own homes. This incident just happened in Texas less than a year ago, where a woman had the cops called on her because she looked suspicious in her old house, and the police officer showed up and shot her in her own home for doing absolutely nothing other than just living in her house, but she looked suspicious. Infant and mother death rates are also higher for people of color. The infant mortality rate for African American children is more than double that of white children, and mothers that are African American are also more likely to die during delivery than white people. And this is largely because studies consistently show that doctors have racial bias and provide inferior treatment to people of color in comparison to white people. For example, one particular study found that doctors were 16% less likely to treat African American heart attack patients with life-saving surgery in comparison to white patients. So this is a lot of information, and I want you to really take this in right now, right? This is a snippet of studies, right? I could have showed you hundreds of studies that prove that there are people in our society today that have what is referred to as racial bias, meaning they privilege certain groups of people, specifically white people, and people of color are disadvantaged. All right? Take this data in, recognize it. Feel uncomfortable looking at this. This should make you uncomfortable. You should not be content with the reality that we live in a racist society today, but we do. So I want to unpack this concept called racial bias. All right? It's not to say that doctors, law enforcement, employers, and educators are intentionally racist, but when you live in a society that socializes you to associate people of color with negative labels and meanings, and to associate white people with positive labels and meanings, we develop what are called implicit racial biases, which affect the way that we view and treat people in our society based on their skin color. So there's a difference between saying someone is racist and saying someone has racial bias. We all have racial bias. As a result of living in the United States today, we cannot control the reality that we are exposed to systems of thinking and institutionalized racism that has taught us that white people are privileged in our society, and subsequently that people of color are less than, right? And what's interesting is that studies even show that people of color have racial bias, right? For example, one study found that even black doctors were more likely to offer preventative health care to white patients than to black patients, okay? So that just goes to show how strong institutionalized racism is in the United States. It even teaches people of color to value other people of color less than white people. All right, so let that sink in. This is important. This is so important, probably the most important lesson that we've covered up to this point in this semester, to recognize that every single one of us in this society, myself included, has racial bias. We cannot control that because of being products of the society that we live in. We can't control the messages that we are exposed to in the media. We can't control how institutionalized racism is built within the fabric of all of the different social structures in our society. So we can't control that we are constantly being sold these messages that white is best and that people of color are inferior. Right? In the following video, we'll take a closer look at racial bias, and we'll also unpack the concepts of white privilege, and most importantly, take a look at some solutions to these problems of racism that we can individually apply in our own lives.